Good day, everyone. It is my great pleasure to give this presentation entitled Moving Toward a Question-Centric Approach for Regulatory Decision-Making in the Context of Drug Development. And I will be sharing the authorship of this presentation with my colleague Ina from SR Lab. This slide is just to say that I have nothing to disclose. As an introductory slide, I wanted to precise that when comes the use of modeling and simulation in the context of drug development, and in particular pediatric drug development, generally this is done as part of an extrapolation approach. And when we think about extrapolation approach, the current regulatory guidance document includes the ICH E11A and the EMA extrapolation reflection paper when comes EU regulatory network. It can be observed that recently alternative new type of data including real-world evidence and advanced analytical methods, including machine learning and AI-based methods, have appeared and are increasingly used in the context of MIDD. However, to date, there is limited regulatory standards and guidance documents to support decision-making where the evidence is mostly based on these new approaches or type of data. Therefore, when this happens, most of the time, the decision-making on the acceptability of this data, this method, or even an MIDD approach based on that will be done on a case-by-case basis. The problem with case-by-case basis is consistency. If we go from an example and we consider a case where we're in a rare disease condition, pediatric rare disease for instance, and then PBPK is being proposed for dose selection because it is assumed that in this pediatric population, similar PK exposure between children and adults might lead to comparable efficacy or safety. If we consider that particular case, several questions should come in the mind of the assessor when looking at the approach. Yes, we in our core job need to release a final decision on to whether or not we agree on the approach proposed, whether the evidence proposed supports a positive opinion, and whether what is proposed is scientifically sound. When looking closely to the case that I have just described, it can be observed that actually we can have different scenarios, and the decision making in each of the scenarios will call different drivers, and we can end up with positive opinion on the one hand and negative opinion on the other hand. I was saying that PBPK would be proposed for dose selection in a pediatric rare disease, but that question can have different regulatory impact actually. If we are in a setting where there's a plan to run a small PK study in the target population, pediatric population, and then PBPK is used for dose selection, for the dose to be used in that study, we would consider that in that case the regulatory impact is medium. However, if the PBPK is to be used without any plan for data collection in the target population and as sole basis for the dose to be used and communicate in the label of the drug in this target population, then we are in another scenario that we would consider high regulatory impact. But the regulatory impact is not the only aspect that gets into consideration when comes the final decision making onto whether or not an approach, a model-based approach, is acceptable in the context of drug development. Actually, the situation can be much more diverse, and several other considerations should be taken into account, including the rarity of the disease, practicality issues, the data available in the source population, here, let's say in adult population, the fact that there are available data on that drug for other indication, maybe in the pediatric population, the fact that there are drugs of the same class that were, and same mechanism action, so to speak, that were approved in that same indication, etc. So, like you see, consideration can go very diverse, and you can even have complicated situation due to the combination of these different aspects, making the actual case-by-case decision by the assessor a very, very tricky exercise. There is therefore a need to move from this decision-making process that would be based on practicability, like feasibility issues, the fact that the study is not doable in the pediatric population, the fact that it is not convenient to draw intensive sampling, etc., and move from this practical data-based decision-making to a more knowledge-based decision-making. What I mean there is that what would make more sense to our view is that the uncertainty related to the answering of the question of interest is considered. And before starting the data collection, before considering the different analytical methods that could inform answering that question, it is established what is the actual uncertainty that needs to be addressed by new data, and how all this data, given the method planned to be used for their analysis, would address and reduce this uncertainty or increase the precision in the dosing of the target population. So it is really a shift in mindset that we are proposing, which would bring us to move from a sort of data-driven approach, saying that normally, for instance, we would consider a randomized controlled trial, but because it's not feasible, then we can consider a small or single-arm trial. Because it's even more complicated in this sort of rare disease condition, we will consider a model-based approach, etc. We should move from this data-informed, empirical data-informed decision-making to a more knowledge-based decision-making, thinking about the overall uncertainty that we're trying to reduce, and thinking also about the precision in the dosing recommendation, for instance, if that is the question of interest that we're trying to achieve. So it is all about a shift in strategy into for the plan, data collection, and analytical methods used. One should observe that it has been a while since the EMA extrapolation reflection paper has been released. From that time already, we were strongly advising qualification of the tools that should be used in the context of extrapolation. We were already thinking about these system-related data and disease-related data, drug-related data, and how to merge all of them together in order to reduce the unknown in the context of extrapolation. However, we have observed that over the years, this approach, very limited, let's say, very limited number of tools have been qualified for their use in the context of extrapolation. This is unfortunate, and we are wondering what could be the reason for that. One reason for that could be that the data generation are not conceived in an appropriate manner that lead the sponsor of the different development program to think that it would be very demanding to collect the data needed to achieve regulatory acceptable qualification. We believe that it is possible to build up an ecosystem which would be based on a question-centric approach and which would permit to benchmark the different available combinations of data and methods in order to address the question of interest. If we are, for instance, interested in characterizing the effect size of a drug in a certain patient population, that can be a pediatric rare disease, we should think about the evidentiary standard. What is the method that would have been used and accepted by the regulators in the absence of all the barriers related to practicability and feasibility? Let's say that method is randomized controlled trials. The first step would be to characterize the overall uncertainty when this method is actually used. And then compare the alternative method and data sources and see whether or not how this method could be benchmarked to the evidentiary standard method for that particular type of question. So here, for instance, we are contrasting single-arm trials, population PK or PPK in a context of extrapolation based on disease similarity, for instance, or PPPK, POP-PK in a context of extrapolation supported by a QSP model describing the disease profile and the response to the treatment. A question-centric approach considers all these data sources that can be informative for the question of interest, and also all the methods that might be relevant for analyzing these data and addressing the question of interest. So the data space would be enlarged, widened, not limited to drug development program and or controlled studies, but can be expanded to real-world evidence, post-marketing data, non-clinical data, quality data. All the data should be analyzed appropriately, and an integrated decision-making process can be envisaged. So each time we are considering a data source, we are also considering the methods that is foreseen for analysis of this data. There are three pillars to the approach that I'm trying to present here. The first is a repository connecting the question, the data, and the methods. Like I said, the data are always connected to the methods used for their analysis. And this combination of data and method always connected to a particular question. For this approach to be implemented efficiently, we need standards, high quality validated standards to ensure the quality of the data used and also the reliability of the method used to analyze the data. Lastly, to even more ensure robustness of this approach, we believe that some automation might be helpful. So here you have some detail on what should go in that repository we're proposing. Like I said, combination of data, methods, and related questions. The context of use need to be clear, and the method used for data analysis need to be adequately qualified. Standards are currently missing, like I said, and these standards would not only be related to methods used for data analysis, but also related to the data searching engine and data structuring, data formatting. Automation is not mandatory, but we think that it can bring a lot into removing, speeding the process, and reducing the number of human-related error into the different process from data source identification, data searching, extraction, formatting, analyzing, and also reporting of the results. The take-home message of this presentation is that model-informed approaches in pediatric and rare disease development are most often medium to high regulatory impact. We do have some guidance document, namely the EMA reflection paper on extrapolation, ICH E11A guideline. However, given the complexity of the method which are currently used, we are recommending using a question-centric approach that would be relevant for combining advanced analytical method, different data sources, and bringing them to an objective decision-making. Thank you.